Welcome back to Kaya Theatre, everyone. Next up, we have Andy Fitzsimon telling us about producing an open font in 2022. Since the dot-com boom, Andy Fitzsimon has fancied himself as an open source designer, one who prefers all the creative tools he uses to be free to modify, adapt, and share. Professionally, Andy has served as global brand manager at Red Hat and various developer roles before joining Outfit.io as their head of strategy. Andy loves free typography and has overseen the creation of the many open source typeface creations, from the original Ubuntu font to Red Hat's many font contributions to more recently the Outfit typeface. That's an important word to say properly for this talk. Okay, so Andy will be taking questions after this talk. There should be a bit of time for questions, so please make sure you post questions you've got for Andy in the questions tab at the top of the chat in Venulus, and I'll pass them on at the end of the talk. Thank you, Andy. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Hi everybody. I'm Andy. I'm a free software graphics guy, and look, this presentation is just to do justice to the amazing software maturity that's out there in the open font land. There was once a time where I could make a really cheap and nasty font, and that's good enough to class it an open source font, but I tell you, the quality of this process and the rigor, and also just the potential of what's happening in this space, it's really skyrocketed. And that's thanks to a few people, but in no small part, my good friends Dave Crossland, who leads the Google Fonts team. And look, without him, the written word would be decades in the past when it comes to our digital interfaces, not just in competence, but also in culture. Like it's just an insane privilege to know that these are living legends. And Dave, what an absolute champion. So he's helped me with this presentation. He's not here to deliver it. He's moving to Denver at the moment. So good on you, Dave. But let's see if I can do the poor man's version of what his presentation would be. So let's crack on. So there's really kind of one main theme for you to get across in fonts, and that is that font choice matters. How we set the words that we communicate is sometimes as important as the words themselves. I'll give you a little cheeky example, but you can think about this open font. It's called Parisian, I think. And look, that's just lovely. You think about, if I say, I will always find you, who's writing that? That's this guy. Hell romantic, really swoony, definitely, setting the tone of those words appropriately. But you could also write the exact same phrase like this. And who's writing that? Probably this guy. Okay, it's the same copy. It was animated in the same way. But you can kind of see that fonts do make a difference to the content that they represent. It's not just an arbitrary thing. I think we all kind of get that. To save you some time, if you want to check out the OpenShift presentation that's happening at the same time as this, go to Google Fonts Knowledge. They've just launched this knowledge base, and it kind of helps you think in fonts and actually appreciate fonts, choose fonts, understand, the visual hierarchies, the rhythm, the way you set type, everything. It's an amazing resource, and it's fairly green. So check that out. If you're still with me, let's do a little bit of a history lesson. So I'm going to talk about font files in particular. So that's the files that have fonts in them. It was a pretty scary place, not too long ago, right? Like, who remembers this sort of stuff? We're talking like power packs, kind of like the bargain bin at a retail store, that kind of stuff. What I love is this, on the right-hand side, they're saying, make your documents explode in 3D. I don't really want my documents to explode, but okay. And on the left-hand side, it's like, D is your CD-ROM drive. Like, it's just reminding me of the times where that was kind of a thing. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I visited that 1001 free font site like all the time. Super crazy, but that's a bit of a blast from the past. Let's go on a little bit further. Nowadays, it's a hell of a lot different to that. There are still really commodity fonts out there of varying levels of quality, produced halfly by hobbyists and whatever else. But hey, we're living in 2022, we have a heap of great software, and not only a heap of great software, we have a heap of know-how about the processes, to build software. And that is everything from distributed revision control to, scripting frameworks to, hella cool languages like Rust. And we also have, again, open source to help us kind of catalyze and drive this stuff together. In particular, this thing. So 2006, Nicholas Spellinger and Victor Gauntley, they got together. Victor is a type designer, and Nicholas worked for a literacy organization called SIL. And they came up with the open font license because it's kind of hard to interpret fonts like font files and font software as software. There is so much about the art, and also, some logistics that make it a little bit harder to, consider the traditional software licenses appropriate for a font project. So there were a few gaps, and Nicholas, has worked tirelessly and created this license. And because of that, we've kind of had a renaissance of fonts being open sourced, the right way. So massive props to them. Let's crack on a little bit, and I'm going to give you, I don't know, the real quick version of the history of typography. Kind of a fun one, a little bit cherry-picked, but hey, that's what we're here for. So we'll kind of get into the first movable type. It was in the Song dynasties in China. Then we get into metal type, right? So, wooden templates of stuff to be printed. It breaks, whereas metal stays around. So good on you. There's a really cool learning website that kind of shows you the history of movable type there, which is awesome. Then we have that moment, the Gutenberg Bible, which is, the first proper printing press. Pretty powerful moment for the history of communication. And then, hey, we kind of cranked it up a notch with the Industrial Revolution. That's awesome. And then we started kind of getting into a bit more of the commercial day with one of my heroes of design, I guess, Beatrice Ward. She worked for Monotype at a time. She's written this, which is just, freaking awesome and inspiring. Again, like there's a heap of badass stuff that this lady was in, but one thing she did was lift the profile of typography, and the importance in the commercial space as well as just in the mind share of people that were communicating. She came up with this one phrase, which is probably one of my favorite phrases discussing typography, which is, people will take a vivid interest in the clothes that words wear, which is probably the nicest way of putting what a font is. We have our words, and then we have the clothes that we dress them in, which is awesome. And she wrote a whole bunch of really cool articles underneath this pseudonym called Paul Boujon. So she got a job working for Monotype, and then they found out she was a woman, after they gave her the job. Nicely done, Beatrice. Sweet. So that's again, just to kind of get you into a little bit of hero worship right there. Let's go into the more specific stuff, though, and this is the relevant part to us, is that digital typography has kind of moved a little bit further. Technically, the first font, that didn't have any digital font, that didn't have any physical presence, was this DigiGrotesque, by this Digiset machine. It was effectively like a CRT kind style projector. So technically, it's a digital font, and that came out of this machine here. Around 1978, this guy, everyone, I hope Donald Knuth. Most software developers, every software developer does, I think. He's been called the Yoda of Silicon Valley, and has done way more than just text and Metafont, but I'll focus on them. Because the modernization of typography was happening from old letterpress style typesetting to, the CRT style, projection and whatever else. Donald Knuth, and also fonts were kind of like all bitmapified. Donald Knuth was like, no, we can use algorithms and parameters to describe letter forms, and he came up with some of the, most eloquent parameterizations of typography written purely in software, and between text for text layout and Metafont for actually describing the letter forms. It revolutionized academic publishing. It also, inspired a hell of a lot of stuff in computer graphics. So, hell yeah, Donald Knuth. Then there's kind of the famous attribution whereby, had Steve Jobs not attended a calligraphy class, had he not dropped into that at Stanford, he probably wouldn't have had such a priority to put calligraphic and other font display types in the 1984 Macintosh. But again, more people at play. He was very inspired with Adobe, who came out with PostScript, and that was put into macOS 1. And that gave us Helvetica, Times, Courier, a heap of great stuff. And this was, pretty cool because, we're talking vector type coming around the corner. So then we get the Apple Microsoft kind of Windows 3 OS 7 period where true type fonts, the format kind of comes around. And it's also around the same time as the end of the Cold War, coincidentally. But yeah, 1989, pretty cool time because that exploded the ease in which fonts can be produced, and also the commoditization of computing around just both of those platforms meant that fonts became more and more important to our collective consciousness, which is cool. And then 1991, Unicode, hell yeah. So I know if you're old enough and old enough in internet years, ISO 8859-1. That's great if you're a Westerner, but it sucks if you live anywhere else. Unicode has been steadfastly working on, a character range, and it's improved every single year. It's super exciting, some of the things they're coming out with, but that kind of helped all computers communicate globally, which is fantastic. That's pretty fantastic there. And then in 1996, the Nintendo 64 came out. I didn't get one, but I played GoldenEye a few times. OpenType came out, which is pretty awesome. Now, OpenType is super important to the maturity of fonts because up until OpenType, you had a font and you had one character expression per character. You also didn't have things like ligatures. So the font that we've just finished, the Outfit font, it has 2 ampersands. It has a soft ampersand, it has a hard ampersand, it has 2 E's, one E on a 45-degree angle, and another E that's flat on. You can have these stylistic alternates within an OpenType font to, describe different shapes and kind of choose them as you're using the font, which is pretty awesome. And the same goes for ligatures, right? You can write a word with, TF or TI or whatever else, and you can join those 2 glyphs into a single glyph if the OpenType font describes it, which is pretty fantastic. And other things like, style caps and whatever. But yeah, OpenType was pretty huge because, hey, it supported Unicode, which is fantastic. And thank you, Microsoft and Adobe, for bringing that to the world. Then, and there had been plenty of ways to get fonts on the web, but you can remember system fonts were a pretty big deal in the early 2000s. Well, and there was, Microsoft had its EOT, but it was not an open. It was, just their standard. Web fonts came out thanks to collaboration between Mozilla, Opera, W3C. And that year, Google Fonts was proposed. It was launched the following year, but the second we were able to use web fonts, as a standard through web browsers, here comes Google Fonts. And then in 2016, finally, if you've been really interested in what Donald Knuth was doing with meta fonts, and that's programmatically describing, the different parameters that you can change, fonts with. Variable fonts actually, became a thing. And the first 2 projects to support it was HalfBuzz and also FreeType. So open source kind of led the way. And this is in large part, if you remember, Bedad, who started or who worked extensively on Pango, which is now HalfBuzz, has been responsible for so much, as far as, text layout and also being able to support font features and whatever else. And you can see here on this slide, there's a little example. You can see the $ kind of loses its stem at a little period that's, parameterized. And you can also see that kind of like the slant on the percentage changes and whatever else. That's all awesome. These projects, HalfBuzz in particular, it's so successful that professional publishing software like Adobe's Photoshop has migrated from their own text layout engine to HalfBuzz. And it's really funny because if you think about some of the Persian and Indic languages, the text layout is more accurate in Photoshop than it is on their desktop publishing tools like Illustrator and InDesign. And that's because they use HalfBuzz in Photoshop, but they still have their own proprietary stack for Illustrator and InDesign. So it's kind of funny that you get a better typography experience in a tool because its upstream is actually the open source project versus what they've had, decades of polishing on. And that's largely because of, the fact that, hey, open source rocks. Let's crack on to the next one. And this year, something cool is coming out, and that is color gradient vector fonts. And also what this kind of means is custom imagery. So if you think about the entire emoji range, that's a lot of pictures. And most of them are bitmaps, which, is pretty heavy-handed. So you couldn't really, reasonably create a web font with emoji on them, and expect that web font to be a pretty small HTTP request. You're probably going to have a pretty heavy typeface. Whereas the color gradient vector fonts, they allow the potential of custom emoji through a web font, which is pretty awesome. And not just custom emoji, but full color substitutions for absolutely any character, including plenty of the features that you'd expect in typography. So these two examples, linux.conf and Google or linux.conf.au, they're all using the color gradient vector font format. And if you're using Chrome 98, it's supported, and it's potentially coming down the pipe in Firefox. That's currently been approved for investigation in upstream. So, but that's super cool because it's going to be horrible for the 2 years after this thing is released, because everyone's going to use it for all kinds of crazy stuff. But it means that we'll be able to have custom interfaces, custom software, really good sites and experiences that leverage standard Unicode instead of having to hack in SVG solutions and whatever else as their text. But what they can still get is the aesthetic benefit of changing what the glyph should look like. So super exciting there. All right, so now here we are into today. So if you wanted to get a font, there's a heap of solutions. Obviously, one of the most trusted sources of quality fonts is fonts.google. There's the font library, Open Foundry, and also if you just search for fonts on GitHub and GitLab, you can get some really compelling fonts. There's programmer fonts and nerd fonts and everything else if you're into that. Some of these are more based on variable fonts. There's vfonts.com and whatever else, but these are all great sources. But we're not just going to talk about getting a font, which is awesome, especially if you want a starting point, because starting with an upstream project is the best way to go. How about making a font, or putting a font? Well, there's the darling of the day, which is it's a proprietary piece of software, but it is the best. Like, it is, when I say the best, I mean it is really compelling and easy to use. So that's why most font designers use it, including the font designer that designed our most recent typeface. There is FontLab, which was the standard for the longest time. So Red Hat's Overpass was produced in FontLab initially and then migrated over to Glyphs. So that's interesting. And then there's RoboFont, which has really, really extensive Python support and scripting languages surrounding it. And you can do lots of hackable things. But not just those three commercial options. There is FontForge, and I use that to produce the original Ubuntu font. May it rest in peace. And then there's also RuneBender, which is completely written in Rust and extremely ambitious, but in the early days, which is kind of awesome. And then there's this MFEK, which is again new and ambitious, but it's kind of trying to reconcile what RuneBender is trying to do with what FontForge is trying to do, and get something that isn't 100% Rust, but a usable, good font editor that is just as powerful as the three above. So really interesting activity happening there, and it's all active. There's been no slowdown in the momentum of this. This is absolutely like a really charged space. One resource that I'd like to point you towards, even if you're going to choose to use a tool that isn't FontForge, is this design with fontforge.com. So that's the user manual effectively for FontForge. And it doesn't just teach you how to use FontForge, it teaches you how to think. Like, it teaches you how to be a type designer. And really, it makes you better at that craft. It's a fantastic resource that goes through kind of trusting your eyes, being intuitive, knowing what forces are at play, when it comes to optical interference and whatever else. And absolutely just a stunning read. Even if you're never going to make a font, I suggest you check that one out. It's pretty awesome. So now let's kind of get into the more techie part of this, which is what impressed me. So like I said at the start of this talk, way back when I made a font, I could just fling it over to a random repository or post it on a static file share, and it'd go up on a website, and I'd be like, sweet, I open sourced a font, I released it. Hey everybody, that's it. But fonts have become so much more pervasive in how they're used, and web fonts in particular, that are being hosted on central CDNs like Google Fonts, they really need rigorous quality control, because let's just say you update your font, you could break the internet. You could actually break the internet by changing the baseline of your typeface accidentally, or missing a character, or setting a decimal wrong on a unit width, and you could do all kinds of things to all kinds of online software or websites, simply because the CDN will faithfully update based on what's the latest upstream. And if they didn't have checks to prevent against that kind of stuff, that's where we'd be. But fortunately, Google and the community surrounding the modern typeface development have come up with some fantastic stuff, some really, really fantastic tools. And here's the 4 kind of main ones. So Google Fonts have their own, GF tools. There's FontMake, and then there's the font tools. They're pretty good for different things. Obviously, GF tools is good for working within the fonts ecosystem. FontMake is a source-to-image kind of compiler, so you don't have to have it'll do the building for you, so you can automate your font building process rather than having to do it manually, which allows you to do a whole bunch of the CI/CD stuff. And then there's a really, really powerful tool called Font Bakery, which brings a lot of those tools together and gives you effectively a linting experience of your type design. So I'll kind of get into a little bit of that, but Font Bakery is definitely the one that impressed me the most. And there's ways that it's being used that are, even more impressive, which is cool. So if you go, it's probably one of the most interesting places on the internet to check out what's happening in upstream fonts, and that's because you're seeing effectively this is the release management process for Google Fonts. It's completely public. They have this Kanban board available to anybody to check out on GitHub, and you can see all down the left-hand side. There's needs, like some of these are point releases for existing fonts. Some of them are completely new fonts. Some of them need like certain changes. Some of them haven't passed certain tests. It's really, really quite rigorous how all of this stuff makes it into the main repository, which is super cool. So won't go too deep into this, but if you just want to see this stuff in action, it's kind of fantastic. There's also, if you're getting started as a font project, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you use Google's unified font repository as your base, even if you have no intentions of publishing this thing to Google Fonts. This thing sets up the GitHub actions for you. It sets up all of the automatic, font analysis tools to give you great feedback on your project. And it also has the build tools there so that you can build your font without having to do all that stuff manually. So it's a pretty fantastic resource for you if you're interested in that. And yeah, look, this is kind of what it looks like. If you commit a change to your upstream repository, it'll run an ocean of tests and produce a self-hosted GitHub Pages website where you can run through and get your feelings really hurt because of the number of errors it shows you. Some of those errors are just warnings and they're totally fine, and you can go, yes, I know I haven't added my copyright yet, or yes, I know that this glyph is suspiciously like this glyph, or whatever else. But it's a fantastic tool, especially when you're releasing, right? Because we're working on the outfit font, and the artwork was completely finished and testing was done, and we tried to break it 100 different ways within our browser, within our desktop publishing tools, within whatever, and then we actually put it through the Font Bakery process. And hey, we had a hell of a lot of stuff to remediate, but it wasn't that hard because we had really specific directions. So Font Bakery is fantastic for that. So yeah, like this font, the Ubuntu font, oh God, ugliest thing ever, hacked together in FontForge. It wouldn't survive today as a font. The quality, it's not fit for use. Overpass, however, is a really interesting story in that the source artwork was the US Federal Highways typeface, usually called Highway Gothic. That was the inspiration, but the digitization of Overpass was a completely new commission. And we commissioned it because that was the aesthetic that was, leading the Red Hat brand at the time. And since Red Hat has moved on from Overpass and now uses Red Hat Display and Red Hat Text and Red Hat Mono, which is their new monospace font, the Overpass project with its monospace variant and its 19 variations including italics, obviously, and 10 weights. I think 10 weights. No, probably 9 weights. It has been maintained upstream, and not only has it been maintained upstream by Delve, who is fantastic, but an entire community of people are not just suggesting improvements, but some people have commissioned improvements. Google has commissioned a massive overhaul so that they could get it working with their CI/CD tool. So yeah, it's pretty incredible. I'll just go on to the next one. And accept cookies. Oh, so bad. So yeah, this is the most recent font that we've just put out. So the organization I work for, Outfit, we're a brand automation company, and we needed a typeface. We already had a logo mark that looked pretty much like this, and we started to commission a bespoke typeface so that it could actually work so that when we spoke, it looked like us, right? So one of the best instruments of success in branding is if you're writing something or if you have something and without seeing the logo or the name of your company, the aesthetic tells you tells the audience who's familiar what brand it is. It gives them that recognition and that recall. That's kind of cool. But honestly, we're also just design nerds, and we wanted to make something super fun. So you can see here, you can see that we have a stylistic G. When we turn off the alternates, it changes. We had a stylistic M and a stylistic K, a stylistic E, everything else. And we also, one of the technical requirements was that when we typed outfit, we had this one gigantic ligature that, combines the OUTFIT exactly as it's meant to be said. And the great thing is, we can do that. We can do that because, hey, it's software. We also were able to, put together varying weights. So as you noticed before in that earlier demo, the $ crossbar cuts off when you get beyond 500, but it's there when you get down to the lower and everything else. And yeah, look, it's just a pretty awesome typeface. But anyway, let's get into some of the cool future stuff for the later part of this talk. So firstly, vector technology in general hasn't slowed down. If you remember previous LCAs, I've probably demoed Inkscape with a spline type called Spiro splines, which are, really awesome and perfect and everything else. But Rafe Levine, who started Spiro, also started Gill, which eventually became Sodipoddy, which eventually became Inkscape. He's been doing a lot of research on how to create a spline that's very intuitive to use. Not just creating beautiful shapes and paths, but also just super intuitive to use. And if you go to his blog, you can see some of the experiments. And this guy doesn't just write a blog; he creates live demos. It's just such a compelling read. We've got a new kind of player in the open source design toolkit, and that's Penpot. If you're familiar with another tool called Figma, I think they're worth about $10 billion now. Well, Penpot is a completely open alternative to Figma. So if you're into application user experience design and anything else, it's there. But one of the cool things is, it has fantastic font support. So you can kind of load up any of the open fonts you like and start designing, create SVG vector compositions with it, which is fantastic. And just coming around the corner, we have some exciting stuff. Personally, I'm pretty stoked on the Goose emoji coming. I'm going to get a hell of a lot of mileage out of that one. But yeah, Unicode 15 is around the corner, and that's cool. But color fonts plus the Unicode editions, that's going to be really awesome, because what you can do with color fonts is, before Unicode has even kind of come out and your platform has created an emoji. Well, I mean, after Unicode's released, let's say there's a period of 4 months before your operating system creates the emoji character for the character that you want. Like, I want my emoji for lavender now, right? Well, what you can do with web fonts and color gradient fonts is you can actually design your lavender emoji yourself and have a website that uses it as a web font. And once the operating systems release the system-specific version of the lavender, yeah, it can gracefully degrade and use the system font if you don't have web fonts. But it's really nice for artists and type designers that we can kind of run ahead of the base operating system and start creating glyphs that are in the specification but not yet supported by a platform. So that's freaking awesome. So anyway, that's kind of it. I'd like to thank Dave again for a hell of a lot of the conversations we had to kind of bring this talk together. And thank you to Work for giving me some time to prepare it. But yeah, let's move on to some questions if we have any.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, we do have questions. Sorry, I'm just like looking really surprised because I'm typing and talking at the same time, which is never good. That was really lovely. As somebody who only knows about fonts as, I guess, a user and appreciator and frequent reader of things, I really enjoyed the kind of behind-the-scenes glimpse in the history tour. That was really eye-opening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a few questions. Our first question. Is it a never-ending task of glyph coverage as the Unicode code points expand?
No, you get to choose where you stop. Just like painting a house. I stopped at the gutters. But I do get what you mean. If you were trying to create a typeface that had full coverage, and Unicode is continuously adding, emoji characters, etc., then yes, okay, yes, a fully complete set will probably have to evolve with that project. Having said that, like our typeface stops at extended Latin, so we don't support Korea, Japan, China, or any of the Persian or Indic scripts, and many of the Cyrillic, characters are also not there. We've got a couple issues asking for Hungarian characters, stuff like that in the upstream. And yeah, like any open source project, you can say, hey, this is cool. Yes, we want to get there, but it's not yet. Or this project, it's out of scope for us to ever attempt that. And when it comes to character glyph coverage for language, just speaking for the Alpha project, yeah, we totally want to have, we want to grow because it's a commercially kind of backed font. We want to grow as the markets we address, are needed, right? So if we want to do business, in the Middle East, we have to have those Persian fonts. Same with Korea, Japan, and China. If we want to do business in Japan, we want to project that competence by having our own custom typeface, then we need the glyph coverage, of those characters. The cool projects to look at is probably Google's Noto project, which started as just, I think, English alphabet and grew into Korea, Japan, and China, and then grew into, I think there's like a Sanskrit version now. It's an enormous project, and it's forever growing. But yeah, like I said, you get to choose where you stop. If I'm going to add one emoji to an upstream font project, it might just be like the koala emoji, and that'll be in my web font, and it'll be a nice small HTTP request payload that won't tank a website. If that answers the question.
Good choice, really. The next question. I am really curious about tests you run on fonts. Can you give us some examples of the checks you think are the most useful?
Yeah, look, a lot of the checks, obviously, when it comes to release management and open source, licensing is a big one. Licensing and naming is pretty huge. Glyph coverage was something that blocked us because we only wanted to have like the QWERTY set as a character range initially. And Google rightfully said, we're not going to host your font, because we have a minimum character set. So checking for that, just checking that you have, all the characters with diacritics that are needed to be compatible with the places that you plan to host and use your font. That's kind of nice because, we all miss stuff, right? Like it could be, you can use the font and there could be system curly braces and you didn't notice that you forgot to do the curly brace characters. So that's kind of nice. But yeah, there's lots of gotchas. It's a really, really extensive list of checks. If you have a look at any font bakery output on any open source project, and they're all super cool. Like it's really insightful to see what those things are.
That's fascinating. Can you make any comments about application-specific fonts other than web or print? For example, Hershey font for plotting, outline fonts for cutting.
Oh, okay. look, some people are hacking fonts to be interface elements because it does give them a really highly compatible set of controls to do user interface stuff that is not, you're just worried about doing that sort of thing in CSS or another method. A great example is if you have a application that cannot have much DOM affecting JavaScript, for example, or you want or little to no JavaScript at all, like in a web app, for example, like on the client side, what you can do is you can have a lot of interactivity purely using web fonts and CSS, right? So you can actually have you can draw whatever element you want, embed that as a variable font, and then have those elements interact using the variable parameters via CSS. And that's kind of like a really interesting application because, you can draw anything and you won't get, it'll run in the data center of a bank, and it'll pass infosec checks. Like, I don't know, like it's kind of like you can hack web font tech into all kinds of interesting interfaces now.
That sounds like quite the rabbit hole to explore.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty cool though, because again, variable fonts, like, you can draw all kinds of stuff in the same way that ASCII art's a thing. Like now you've got ASCII art plus the power to do so much with the typography within it. So, wow. Yeah, keen on the terminal stuff.
So much fun to be had. Okay, next question is, what are you most excited about in the next 1 to 2 years in the open font space?
Honestly, I think the proximity to software rigor has really elevated it. I know lots of designers that collect commercial typefaces, like entrepreneurs collect domains, like, oh, I'll use that in a project at some point. And it's kind of, it's nice to see that with the right kind of practices to ensure really, really high quality fonts, and the fact that there's so much visibility and priority and advocacy for them. I'm excited to see where that goes for the creators of typefaces and what that means for everything from funding models to projects and all those things in between. You got to remember that 20 years ago, commissioning a custom digital typeface, was a multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars endeavor to produce, right? So that was usually reserved for the largest organizations in the world that still had a need for a custom typeface but were able to pay for those projects. Now it's become much easier to produce these things, and also much easier to release those things. So I work for a medium-sized business, and we're able to commission a bespoke font, and it's because the tooling was there, the technology was there, the release management was there. And there's also, there's economic incentives to be better at your branding, and typefaces are one of the quintessential pieces of a branding aesthetic. So I'm really excited about that, and I love the fact that I didn't even have to fight for our font to be open source. If we wanted it released on Google Fonts, it had to be open source. So that's one of the biggest gravitational pulls to contributions to the commons that you can think of. The payoff for us is, G Suite will use fonts from Google Fonts. Therefore, if we ever wanted to use G Suite with our corporate typeface, we actually had to open source our typeface. I love that. I just love that the economics played in the advantage of an open project, rather than even entertaining the discussion of, well, what if we keep it proprietary? Just you couldn't even do it. It wasn't a question.
Yeah, that's huge. That really must make quite a huge influence. That's great.
Yep. And whether we're good at business or bad at business, there'll be something useful for artists and creators, so it's nice.
That is lovely. On the topic of collecting fonts and discovery, there's a question, is there an app out there that makes finding and installing open fonts on Linux super easy? I think there used to be a few apps like this on Windows in the day. I think they were on the CDs you mentioned.
God damn. Yeah. I love that was something that I would have spent like $20 on, like 1,000 fonts. That I probably have a few of them somewhere. But as far as if you go to FlatHub, there's like a bunch of different font installer applications. off the top of my head, I don't know many, but it's also super easy to install a font on Linux, right? Like if it's your home directory, just create a private directory called .fonts in your home, and then whatever you throw in there will be sucked up by most desktops. So that's as plain as it can get.
Yeah, I've installed fonts individually on Linux like that.
Yeah, and the coolest thing is then you can just go and track upstream and just do like a big, like git pull depth --1 of whatever project you like, and you can update it yourself if you ever want.
That's cool. I haven't tried that. I guess the other aspect of the question is about, do you have any recommendations around discovery of specifically open fonts for those of us who aren't immersed in the world like you are?
Yeah. So I have a list on these slides. We'll put them out there. But look, Google Fonts really is such a good archive of these fonts. Regardless how you feel about Google as a CDN or player in the cloud space, they have made an enormous contribution to the quality and breadth and depth of fonts. And that's undeniable, and it's still a great place to discover and learn and get fonts. Font Library and Open Foundry are both pretty fantastic as well. And then, look, there is, the major repositories. Like, there are so many exciting font projects that are coming together. In particular, programmer fonts and IDE fonts. If you use, the Powerline character set for your terminal, like that, there's a heap of fonts that have been branched just so that they can add extra characters or extra icons, and you'll have to find them upstream. You'll have to go to GitHub or GitLab or wherever they are. But this is a pretty good set of places to discover a font.
Just got a very specific question has just been added that I have to ask. Whatever happened to Open Baskerville?
There's Libra Baskerville, but Open Baskerville, I'm not familiar. That might be the one that Simon was working on, maybe. And I'm not certain of the history there. But I will take this opportunity to say that my favorite ampersand in the world is the Baskerville italic ampersand. So hope that helps.
That's good to know, coming from like you're an actual like design person who knows fonts. So that's a high recommendation.
Libra Baskerville is an open Baskerville project for what it's worth. So you can get that at Font Library or fonts.google, and it's a real thing, and it's great.
I'll have to look that one up myself. We've got one last question in there, and we've got a minute and a half left to ask it. Is the line between fonts and Unicode code points blurry, or is it just me?
No, they're pretty, like, fonts. Most of the font formats are using, the Unicode range for their glyphs. So they're kind of very, like, you need Unicode to, set where the character is, and you need, the font is just displaying that character however it wants.
It's the clothes. I loved that quote you shared.
Yeah, super fun. That's such a cool quote.
That's great. I'll remember that one.
Cool.
Okay, we have a bit under a minute left if you've got any last words, Andy, but we're out of questions.
Hey, I hope everybody has a fantastic Saturday and the rest of LCA. Thanks for putting it on. And I can't help myself. If you've got a marketing department, send them my way. That's kind of it.
I really enjoyed that. As I said, Andy, thank you so much for telling us all about the world of open fonts and the current state of things. And
My pleasure. Cool. Catch you later, everybody. Bye.